This is Tom Fox. I'd like to welcome you to the Compliance Week 2022 podcast series. Compliance Week is thrilled to be back 100% live and in person after 3 years apart. Back for its 17th year at Compliance Week National 2022, compliance, ethics, legal, and audit professionals will gain insights and make connections at the industry's premier cross-industry national compliance event, offering knowledge-packed, accredited sessions and take-home advice from the most influential leaders in the compliance community. In this podcast series, we will detail some of the speakers and what they will be discussing at the event and why they're attending Compliance Week 2022. I hope you will join me in attending this conference, and particularly this year when it's literally the first major compliance conference which will be held live since the pandemic began. We link to the conference in the show notes, and listeners to this podcast get a special discount, which is also listed in the show notes. I hope to see you in May at Compliance Week 2022. In this episode, I visit with Mary Shirley, Head of Culture of Integrity and Compliance Education at Fresenius Medical Care, on a couple of panels she's participating in: the current state of compliance and what's in store for the future, and the journey to compliance and the path ahead. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back for another episode. Today, I'm thrilled to have with me my friend and colleague, Mary Shirley. Mary's well known to the compliance community as one of the co-founders of GWIC, or the Great Women in Compliance podcast, book, community, oeuvre, and movement. So, Mary, with that incredibly long-winded introduction, first of all, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Tom. It's always good to work with you.
So, Mary, you are on a couple of different panels at Compliance Week, but before we get to those, I was wondering if you could tell our audience your current role.
Sure. So you mentioned some of the activities that I do outside my day job, which is the one that actually pays me and keeps me alive. So big shout out to Fresenius Medical Care. I work in both the compliance and legal departments currently. I'm mainly tethered to the compliance department. It's what I joined the company for. And I head up the culture of integrity function, which is relatively new, as well as compliance training and communications. And I do that on a global scale. And then for legal, even though I'm in a different department, it really is a compliance role because we got into a bit of trouble in 2019 and settled with the US government. And as a result of that, in addition to the fiscal or pecuniary penalties that were awarded to us, we also got a monitorship. So I'm on the monitor liaison team for the company. So it's another global role. And I help with the site visits and investigations that we do as part of that function. So that about sums up my core competencies.
So let's turn to Compliance Week 2022, because you've got a couple of different events that you're either leading or participating in. And I'd like to start with the leadership panel, which is entitled The Current State of Compliance and What's in Store for the Future. It's moderated by Steve Naughton, and you're one of a panel of, frankly, I think, superstar compliance professionals on it. But I was wondering if you could maybe give a hint of the things that you want to talk about or hope to bring to the panel.
Sure, happy to do so. So, Steve has been an amazing moderator and put a lot of work into identifying some of the areas that I would say that we're going to focus on in terms of the future gazing aspect of the state of compliance. And what's going through my mind currently for future gazing or things that we should keep an eye on would be in the United States. I'm anticipating that within the decade, there will be a federal data privacy law in place. And I think for anyone who's looking to get into a good niche area, especially if you're based in the United States, this is a great place to be. We know that ESG is another hot area, and I would expect a bit of our discussion on the panel to be about ESG, what companies are doing in that space, and what we can anticipate for the future. I think another area which is worth keeping an eye on and does hark back to the current state of compliance, but also continuous and ongoing changes, is the evolution of the compliance discipline from regulatory compliance to an ever growing focus on reputational risk, ethics, and integrity. And so the concept of just because you can doesn't mean you should, and why that should be important for compliance functions, because that particular area is one that it's relatively hard to define. It's difficult to put borders around it, and it's a bit of a slippery slope. So I think that's a really interesting area, but one, as you can probably tell with my title being Head of Culture of Integrity, one that I'm particularly interested in and excited about for the future.
Mary, you're also moderating a panel entitled uh, The Journey to Compliance and the Path Ahead, which is listed under a Women in Compliance Brunch and Learn. What do you hope to be able to bring to us with that panel?
Mm. So similar to what Lisa Fine and I have hoped to achieve with the GWIC podcast, we're going to be focusing on some of the unique challenges that women in particular face in the workforce. But what I would say about this session is that it is absolutely open to great gentlemen in compliance to join as well. So a bit like the podcast, it really is open and inclusive to all, but it may be the case that some of the topics and issues that we're going to focus on. So, for example, a little sneak peek is one of them is pay parity. And what we've seen is that obviously, from a global and historical perspective, the place of women in a commercial setting and in business has greatly improved. However, interestingly, in this day and age, the Barker Gilmore compensation benchmarking report, as well as the Inside the Mind of the CCO, which is a Compliance Week study, they both show that women continue to trail behind men in terms of compensation packages in compliance. And so we'd like to talk a little bit about that and give some tips for the GWIC that are attending as to how they can better position themselves when it comes to negotiating and so on, to help really make this issue a problem of the past rather than our future. And I think what's really interesting about the fact that this is still a problem is that compliance actually does quite well in terms of representation of women, including at the C suite level. So we do see a lot of women in the chief compliance officer and equivalent positions. So, why is it that we're still trailing behind when it comes to being paid what we deserve?
Mary, now I'd like to ask, what do you hope to get out of Compliance Week 2022, or why are you excited about attending this year's conference?
Mm. So I think the obvious answer that I assume everyone that has the pleasure of appearing on this series is going to point out is that this is the first in-person event for Compliance Week for a couple of years now. So it's really been a long sip between drinks, and I'm very excited to see, well, what you again. You and I haven't seen each other in quite some time, and the remainder of the compliance community that is attending. I think another aspect that I'm excited about is the fact that Compliance Week has had some changes which will impact on how the event is run. So, for example, we've now seen Kyle take over in the editorial head role. We've seen Marina come in as the conference planning head. And so just seeing the event with, fresh eyes, different people involved, I think that means there's going to be a little bit of a shake-up. And so I think that that's a great way for Compliance Week to be continuously evolving and changing and keeping up themselves. And finally, on a very personal front, I am very pleased to have been recognized by Compliance Week as a finalist in the Excellence in Compliance Awards as being in contention for Mentor of the Year. So, as you can imagine, it's very exciting. Given the name of our book is called Sending the Elevator Back Down, to be recognized for my efforts to pay it forward to the compliance community, and looking forward to seeing the results and all the winners of the prestigious awards.
Well, Mary, I am certainly looking forward to seeing you in person again, and I can't wait for Compliance Week 2022. Thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Pleasure. See you soon.
This is Tom Fox again. I hope you will plan to join me and Matt Friedman at Compliance Week 2022. Matt is a dynamic speaker. He's been talking about these issues literally as long as anyone else for the past 30 years, and it's an important issue. When you couple Matt with Forrest Deegan, you have one of the most dynamic panels that is going to occur at Compliance Week. I've linked in the show notes to information about registration. And of course, there's a discount code for listeners to this podcast. This is Tom Fox, and I look forward to visiting with you again and seeing you at Compliance Week 2022.